Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of Regency society no tale quite so chilling as that of a lady condemned by the very hand she once hoped would lead her to the altar. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most haunting tale of betrayal, injustice, and a love that survived even the shadow of the gallows. Should this chronicle of passion and peril move your heart, I beg you might share your thoughts in the comments below, and perhaps recommend this tale to fellow devotees of romance by pressing that subscribe button. For the best stories, like the finest aged port, are meant to be shared and savored in good company. The spring of 1814 had arrived in London with all its usual promise of renewal, though for Miss Isabel St. Fair, the season brought more anxiety than anticipation. She resided in the modest townhouse of her maternal aunt, Mrs. Philippa Weatherby, a widow of limited means whose circumstances had been reduced by unfortunate investments. The house on Wimpole Street spoke quietly of genteel poverty in its faded curtains and carefully mended upholstery. At 22, Isabel possessed that rare grace which poverty sometimes bestows, a composure suggesting breeding rather than fortune. She had inherited her late father's fine features: gray eyes the color of morning mist over the Thames, dark chestnut hair catching amber lights in candlelight, and a countenance marked by the subtle tension of financial worry. Sir Matthew St. Fair had been a baronet of ancient lineage but modest estate, and his death 4 years prior had left his only daughter with little more than her name and her aunt's reluctant protection. Mrs. Weatherby reminded her niece frequently of the burden such guardianship imposed, making pointed observations about marriageable young ladies who had secured advantageous matches during previous seasons. The Ton had initially welcomed Sir Matthew's daughter into its lower circles, but her position remained precarious, too well-born to be ignored, too impoverished to be seriously courted by gentlemen of property. During a musical at Mrs. Davinia Thornfield's home in late March, Isabel's fortunes had appeared to take an unexpected turn. Lord Edmund Carrington had entered the drawing room with an air of innate command that caused conversations to falter and mothers to straighten in their seats. The Viscount Carrington, at 26, possessed both fortune and person to recommend him. Estates in Derbyshire and Kent yielding £8,000 per annum, along with strong features and the easy confidence of one who had never known want. Through a series of circumstances involving a spilled cup of orgeat and Mrs. Thornfield's intervention, Isabel had found herself conversing with his lordship during the interval. When she offered a thoughtful observation about Mozart's genius for combining mathematical precision with emotional depth, his expression had shifted from polite attention to genuine interest. What followed had been 3 months that Isabel would later recall with painful clarity. Lord Edmund had begun calling upon her, always properly with Mrs. Weatherby present, during the prescribed hours between 3 and 5 o'clock. He had secured her hand for 2 dances at the Marchioness of Queensberry's ball. He had encountered her with suspicious frequency during her morning walks in Hyde Park, when she exercised the neighbor's spaniel in exchange for reduced rent. Mrs. Weatherby had been beside herself with cautious jubilation. Other ladies of their acquaintance had treated Isabel with new envy and speculation. Even the patronesses of Almack's had begun to notice her. Lord Edmund had sent thoughtful flower arrangements with literary quotations, recommended books, discussed poetry, and listened to her observations with attention that suggested he valued her mind as well as her person. She had been foolish enough to imagine he might be falling in love with her. The destruction of that hope had arrived in mid-June with the appearance of Lady Sienna O'Brien at a soirée. The Irish beauty had swept into London society like a summer storm, all vibrant auburn hair, emerald eyes, and wild grace suggesting wind-swept cliffs rather than measured propriety. She was the daughter of an Irish earl, possessing impeccable lineage and a dowry rumored to be £15,000. More devastatingly, she possessed that ineffable quality of fascination that made her the center of any gathering. Isabel had been standing near a column when Lord Edmund first laid eyes upon Lady Sienna. She had watched his expression transform, watched the polite attention he had so recently bestowed upon her transfer to the Irish beauty with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. Within a week, Lord Edmund had ceased his visits to Wimpole Street. Within a fortnight, he was seen driving Lady Sienna through Hyde Park in his curricle, a public declaration of courtship that left no room for misunderstanding. Within 3 weeks, whispers filled every drawing room that the Viscount Carrington would shortly offer for the Irish Earl's daughter. Mrs. Weatherby had been devastated on her niece's behalf, though her distress manifested in tight-lipped silence, somehow worse than recrimination. Isabel had borne the humiliation with outward composure, holding her head high even as she felt pitying and speculative glances following her movements. The cut had been delivered without malice. Lord Edmund had made no promises, had never formally declared himself. Yet the pain felt no less acute for being socially sanctioned. She had truly believed he cared for her. That was the worst of it. Not the loss of potential security, but the crushing disappointment of having misread what she thought was genuine feeling. It was in this state of wounded pride and suppressed heartbreak that Isabel had encountered Lady Constance Hartley at a garden party in early July. Lady Constance Hartley had been widowed 2 years prior, and at 31 possessed both considerable personal beauty and the freedom that widowhood granted to women of means. Her late husband had been a wealthy merchant who had purchased his baronetcy and promptly died, leaving his considerably younger widow with substantial fortune and burning desire to ascend higher in the social hierarchy. Lady Constance had approached Isabel at the Richmond garden party with a smile of sympathetic understanding that women sometimes offer fellow sufferers. She had been elegantly dressed in pale lavender silk that set off her golden hair and china blue eyes to perfection. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, yet something in the set of her mouth suggested steel beneath the pretty exterior. The widow had settled beside Isabel with a rustle of expensive fabric and a sigh speaking of shared feminine tribulation. She had begun by commenting on the garden's beauty, then moved with practiced ease to observations about the season's notable matches, and finally, with all the appearance of spontaneous sympathy, had remarked upon how difficult it must be for Miss St. Fair to witness Lord Carrington's pursuit of Lady Sienna after his attentions had been so marked in the spring. Isabel, caught off guard by this direct acknowledgement of her humiliation, had responded with more honesty than wisdom. She had admitted that she had perhaps been foolish to read more into his lordship's civility than warranted, confessed that she ought to have known better than to imagine a gentleman of such consequence could seriously consider a lady of her diminished circumstances. Lady Constance had listened with deep understanding, occasionally offering sympathetic touches upon Isabel's hand. Then she had revealed, with convincing detail, that she too had once hoped to secure Lord Edmund's regard, that he had called upon her during her mourning period, seemed to offer promise of something more, and had withdrawn his attentions with the same abruptness Isabel had experienced. She spoke of his character with mixture of admiration and criticism, praising his honor whilst suggesting a certain fickleness of heart, a tendency to be dazzled by novelty rather than valuing steadier qualities. The picture Lady Constance painted was of a man who enjoyed the chase more than the capture. It was all delivered with such apparent sincerity that Isabel found herself nodding in agreement, feeling her pain validated. Then Lady Constance had moved to more dangerous territory. She had observed, with studied casualness, that Lady Sienna seemed pleasant, though perhaps unsophisticated for London society. She wondered aloud whether the Irish beauty might benefit from friendship with a lady who could guide her through subtle intricacies of proper behavior. And would it not be Christian charity, Lady Constance had suggested with apparent inspiration, for Miss St. Fair to offer such friendship? The reasoning had been presented with such cleverness that Isabel had not immediately perceived its poison. By befriending Lady Sienna, Isabel would demonstrate gracious magnanimity that could only elevate her standing in society and perhaps even cause Lord Edmund to reconsider his dismissal of her worthiness. More insidiously, Lady Constance had suggested that close proximity might reveal flaws in Lady Sienna's character that were not apparent in artificial settings. If the Irish lady proved less perfect than she appeared, surely Lord Edmund would recognize his error. Isabel, wounded and vulnerable, had found herself considering this proposition. The logic appealed to her bruised pride. She could demonstrate superior character through gracious behavior whilst maintaining proximity rather than being entirely cast aside. More than that, the offer of a female confidant was a balm to a spirit starved of genuine friendship. Her aunt's constant criticism had left her isolated, and the prospect of an elegant, understanding ally like Lady Constance was too tempting to resist. She did not see that Lady Constance Hartley was positioning her as the perfect scapegoat for a crime not yet committed. Over the following weeks, Isabel had indeed cultivated Lady Sienna's acquaintance. The Irish beauty had been surprisingly receptive, seeming genuinely pleased to have found a female friend. Lady Sienna proved to be without artifice. Her charm stemmed from genuine warmth, and her attachment to Lord Edmund appeared sincere. She spoke of him with mixture of admiration and tentative affection, suggesting she was falling truly in love, and expressed anxiety about navigating English society as his future Viscountess. These conversations ought to have made Isabel retreat. Instead, guided by Lady Constance's continued encouragement and her own confused mixture of pain and perverse curiosity, she continued the friendship. Lady Constance had begun including both younger women in her social gatherings, hosting intimate tea parties where the three ladies formed what appeared to be close female friendship. During one such gathering in late July, in Lady Constance's elegantly appointed drawing room in Berkeley Square, the seeds of destruction were truly planted. Isabel noted, with a flicker of disquiet she could not name, how Lady Constance often refilled Lady Sienna's teacup herself, a gesture of solicitous care that also gave her complete control over what the younger woman consumed. Lady Sienna had complained of persistent headaches and difficulty sleeping, symptoms she attributed to strain of constant social engagements and anxiety of impending betrothal. Lady Constance had suggested that Lady Sienna might benefit from a tonic to restore her nerves. She mentioned a woman, Mrs. Dilworth near Clerkenwell, who prepared herbal remedies that had proven most efficacious. The widow had offered to provide the direction and a note of introduction, though she regretted she could not accompany Lady Sienna herself. Lady Sienna had expressed interest but hesitation. She knew nothing of London beyond Mayfair and feared venturing into unfamiliar neighborhoods. Lady Constance had turned to Isabel with apparently innocent suggestion. Would not Miss St. Fair, who knew London far better, be willing to escort Lady Sienna to obtain these helpful remedies? Isabel, trapped by the logic of friendship she had herself initiated and by her desire to appear helpful rather than bitter, had agreed. She did not question why Lady Constance, with her greater resources, did not simply send a servant. She did not wonder why the widow seemed so particularly insistent on this arrangement. The excursion to Clerkenwell had taken place 2 days later. Isabel and Lady Sienna, accompanied by Lady Sienna's maid, had traveled by hackney coach to the address provided. Mrs. Dilworth had proven to be a gray-haired woman of indeterminate age, operating from rooms above an apothecary shop. She had seemed to expect them, greeting Isabel by name and presenting already prepared packages wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. What Isabel could not have known was that Lady Constance had visited Mrs. Dilworth days earlier, providing Isabel's description and paying handsomely for her cooperation in the deception. The packages Lady Sienna purchased contained nothing more harmful than valerian root and chamomile. The poison would come from an entirely different source. Lady Sienna had begun taking the tonic as directed. For several days, she reported feeling somewhat improved. Then, 3 weeks after that fateful excursion to Clerkenwell, Lady Sienna had collapsed during a morning call at the Duchess of Somerton's home. The physician summoned to attend her had quickly determined that the lady had been poisoned. The symptoms were unmistakable, indicating arsenic in significant quantities. Lady Sienna had been conveyed to her father's rented house in Grosvenor Square, where she lay in a state between life and death. The scandal had erupted with terrible force. Who could have poisoned the lovely Irish lady? The Bow Street runners had been summoned, and their investigation had moved with terrible swiftness toward one conclusion. Miss Isabel St. Fair had been the spurned woman. Miss St. Fair had been seen purchasing substances from a woman of questionable reputation. Miss St. Fair had befriended Lady Sienna with suspicious timing and had been present at numerous occasions when the Irish lady had consumed food and drink. Miss St. Fair had motive, means, and opportunity. The evidence seemed damning, and society had accepted the narrative with barely a moment's hesitation. When the runners had arrived at Wimpole Street to arrest Isabel, she had been so stunned she could barely form coherent protests. Mrs. Weatherby had collapsed into hysterics. The neighbors had gathered to witness the spectacle, and Isabel had been conveyed to Newgate Prison to await trial for attempted murder. Newgate Prison existed as a monument to human suffering. For a gently bred lady such as Isabel, the conditions proved almost incomprehensible in their brutality. She had been placed in a small chamber containing nothing but a narrow cot, a chamber pot, and walls that wept moisture. The window, high and barred, admitted little light. The sounds that penetrated her isolation spoke of human degradation she had never imagined. The trial had been swift, conducted with that peculiar combination of legal formality and predetermined conclusion. Isabel had stood in the dock, her gray dress carefully chosen to suggest innocence and respectability. She had watched as witness after witness had testified to facts that, assembled in sequence, formed a narrative of jealous vengeance that bore no resemblance to her actual intentions, but possessed terrible internal logic she could not effectively counter. A shopkeeper from Clerkenwell had testified that he had seen Miss St. Fair entering Mrs. Dilworth's establishment. Mrs. Dilworth herself had appeared to confirm that Miss St. Fair had purchased substances from her. Lady Constance Hartley, appearing as witness with apparent reluctance and visible distress, had testified that Miss St. Fair had seemed peculiarly insistent on befriending Lady Sienna. Most damningly, Lord Edmund Carrington himself had provided testimony. He had appeared before the court in formal dress, his features set in lines of grief and barely suppressed rage. He confirmed that he had paid particular attention to Miss St. Fair during spring months, though he insisted he had never made promises beyond what ordinary civility might warrant. He acknowledged that he had subsequently pursued Lady Sienna with honorable intentions. He stated that he had noticed Miss St. Fair's continued presence in Lady Sienna's company, and had thought it demonstrated admirable character rather than concealed malice. When asked directly if he believed Miss St. Fair capable of such a crime, Lord Edmund had paused for a long moment. His dark eyes had met Isabel's across the courtroom, and in them she had seen disappointment, betrayal, and the particular pain of a man who believes he has been deceived. He had answered that he could not claim to truly know Miss St. Fair's character, that perhaps none of them had known her as well as they had imagined. He spoke the words as if they were shards of glass in his throat, each one a betrayal of the instinct that screamed in silent protest. He had stated that the evidence spoke for itself. It was a careful answer, neither explicitly condemning nor defending, but its effect had been utterly damning. Isabel's defense had been heartbreakingly inadequate. Her solicitor had argued that his client's character spoke against such accusations. He had called Mrs. Weatherby to testify to Isabel's gentle nature. But Isabel's defense had no alternative explanation for the evidence. She could not explain why Lady Constance would wish to harm Lady Sienna. She could only protest her innocence with increasing desperation whilst the weight of circumstantial evidence mounted against her. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge had sentenced her to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for 3 weeks hence. Isabel had been returned to Newgate in a state of shock so profound that she moved as though trapped in a nightmare. The reality seemed impossible to comprehend. She, who had never deliberately harmed another soul, was condemned to die for a crime she had not committed. The days that followed her sentencing had taken on a quality of surreal horror. Mrs. Weatherby had visited once, weeping so violently that the jailer had removed her. The elderly woman had been unable to meet Isabel's eyes, and her niece had understood that even her own aunt harbored doubts about her innocence. The prison chaplain had urged her to confess her sin, to seek absolution whilst time remained. When she had insisted with desperate intensity that she was innocent, he had patted her hand with condescending sympathy. Isabel had existed in a state of numb despair, her mind circling endlessly through events that had led to her condemnation, searching desperately for some explanation she had missed. She replayed every conversation with Lady Constance, every moment of that excursion to Clerkenwell. She could find no answer. The nights were worst. In the darkness, Isabel was left alone with knowledge of what awaited her. The cart ride through jeering crowds, the platform erected just outside Newgate Prison itself, the rough hemp rope, the moments of choking struggle. The thought of such a death filled her with terror so profound that she sometimes found herself unable to breathe. She thought often of Lord Edmund during those dark hours. She remembered the way he had looked at her during spring months, the conversations they had shared, the hope she had allowed herself to feel. She remembered, with bitter clarity, his face in the courtroom, the disappointment and disgust in his expression as he had regarded her. She had loved him. She realized now with the clarity of impending mortality. She had truly loved him, and he believed her capable of attempted murder. As the days passed and her execution date approached, Isabel found strange calm settling over her terror. If she must die, she would do so with dignity. She would not confess to a crime she had not committed. She would face death as her father's daughter, as a saint fair, with whatever courage she could summon. It was on the morning of her final day, as gray dawn light filtered through the high window, that Isabel heard unusual commotion in the corridor outside. Raised voices, rapid footsteps, the jailer's protests giving way to someone's insistent demands. The door to her cell was flung open with violence that made her flinch. There, framed in the doorway, stood Lord Edmund Carrington. He was disheveled in a way she had never seen him, his cravat loose, his dark hair disordered, his eyes wild with some emotion she could not immediately identify. He stared at her for a long moment, breathing heavily as though he had been running. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and urgent. She was innocent. Lady Constance Hartley had confessed to the crime. Isabel was free. The events leading to Lord Edmund's dramatic appearance at Newgate had begun 2 days prior, when Lady Victoria Montrose, a dowager countess of formidable intellect, had approached him at his club. She had been struck by an inconsistency in Lady Constance Hartley's trial testimony, and she recalled certain details about the widow's character that had troubled her. The elderly countess had also observed Lady Constance's own marked attention to Lord Edmund during spring and early summer, an attention that bordered on the obsessive. Lady Victoria had presented her observations and concerns. Initially, Lord Edmund had been resistant, his grief over Lady Sienna's condition and his anger at Isabel's supposed betrayal making him reluctant to entertain alternative theories. But Lady Victoria had been persistent, and she possessed both the social standing and force of personality to demand his attention. She had pointed out that Lady Constance had been the one to suggest the herbal remedy, to provide the direction to Mrs. Dilworth, to arrange for Isabel to escort Lady Sienna on that fateful excursion. She noted that the widow's testimony had been delivered with calculated reluctance. Most tellingly, she revealed that Lady Constance had been seen in Clerkenwell on multiple occasions prior to Isabel's visit. Lord Edmund, once the seed of doubt had been planted, had begun to examine the evidence with fresh eyes. He had reviewed testimony, considered timeline of events, and recognized with growing horror that he had allowed his own wounded pride and grief to blind him to possibilities he ought to have considered. With Lady Victoria's assistance and backing of his considerable social influence, Lord Edmund had launched an investigation that consumed him entirely. Through the following night and into the next day, he dispatched trusted servants into the darkness, sending them racing toward Clerkenwell with urgent instructions and heavy purses. In his study, he pored over coaching records by the trembling light of candles that burned down to stubs, his eyes growing red-rimmed as he traced Lady Constance's movements through the city. Each discovery, a coachman's testimony, a shopkeeper's recollection, a discrepancy in dates, added another piece to the terrible puzzle taking shape before him. When his agents returned from the apothecary shop with purchase records showing quantities of arsenic far exceeding any legitimate use, Lord Edmund had felt the blood drain from his face. Each entry in that ledger was another nail in the coffin of an innocent woman, and he had been the one wielding the hammer. The horror of what he had done, what he had nearly allowed to be completed, threatened to overwhelm him even as it drove him forward with desperate urgency. He had sent trusted servants to locate and question Mrs. Dilworth, offering substantial sums for honest testimony. Most damningly, when his agents had searched the apothecary shop, they had discovered those damning purchase records, quantities purchased using funds traced back to a banking account controlled by Lady Constance Hartley. Mrs. Dilworth, confronted with this evidence and offered immunity from prosecution, had broken down and confessed her role in the scheme. Lady Constance had approached her months earlier with a proposal. She would pay handsomely for the woman's cooperation in a plan to discredit a rival. Mrs. Dilworth was to prepare harmless herbal tonics and give them to a young Irish lady who would be brought to her by Miss Saintfair. But Mrs. Dilworth had grown suspicious when news of Lady Sienna's poisoning had spread. She had recognized the symptoms and realized that Lady Constance's intentions had been far darker than represented. The gray-haired woman had been terrified into silence by the widow's subsequent visit, during which Lady Constance had made veiled threats. Only the promise of protection and immunity had finally loosened Mrs. Dilworth's tongue. Armed with this information, Lord Edmund had confronted Lady Constance Hartley at her residence in Berkeley Square. He had arrived unannounced, bypassing her butler through sheer aristocratic authority. He had found the widow in her drawing room, dressed for a soirée she was to attend that night. Lord Edmund had presented the evidence systematically: testimony from Mrs. Dilworth, records from the apothecary, witness accounts of her visits to Clerkenwell, inconsistencies in her trial testimony. He had watched as Lady Constance's beautiful face had transformed, the mask of sympathetic concern falling away to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. Initially, the widow had attempted denial. She had expressed shock that his lordship could credit such accusations. But as Lord Edmund had continued his relentless presentation of facts, her protests had become weaker, more desperate. Then, as the reality of her situation became undeniable, Lady Constance's demeanor had shifted entirely. The pretense of wounded innocence had evaporated, replaced by hard fury that made her scarcely recognizable. She had stood from her chair, her china blue eyes glittering with intensity bordering on madness, and had unleashed a torrent of justification and accusation. She had loved Lord Edmund, she declared with fierce possession. Loved him with a passion he had been too blind to recognize. She had waited patiently through her mourning period, had made herself available to him, but he had ignored her, had wasted his attention on that impoverished nobody Isabel Saintfair, then transferred his regard to that Irish upstart who had no understanding of English society. Lady Sienna had needed to be removed. Once the Irish beauty was gone, once Lord Edmund's infatuation had been eliminated, he would have turned his attention back to eligible ladies of his own sphere. And who better than Lady Constance herself, who possessed beauty, fortune, and sophistication? As for Isabel, the widow had continued with venomous satisfaction. That scheming little fortune hunter had deserved everything that befell her. It had been almost too easy to manipulate her into the role of scapegoat. Lady Constance had described her plan with the pride of an artist discussing a masterpiece. She had cultivated Isabel's friendship specifically to position her as the perfect suspect, arranged the excursion to establish evidence, administered the poison herself during multiple occasions when all three ladies had taken tea together in her drawing room. It had been, the widow had declared with twisted satisfaction, a perfect crime. Even now, Lady Constance had insisted with desperate conviction, even with her confession, she had acted out of love for him. Lord Edmund had immediately summoned the authorities. Lady Constance Hartley had been taken into custody while screaming accusations and professions of love that chilled the blood of all who heard them. It was with this knowledge, and with legal documents necessary to secure Isabel's immediate release, that Lord Edmund had rushed to the prison in those early morning hours. Now, standing in the doorway of her cell, seeing her pale face and the shadows beneath her eyes, Lord Edmund felt the full weight of his failure crash upon him. Isabel stared at him in silence, unable to process the words he had spoken. Free. She was free. Lady Constance had confessed. The nightmare was over. But as relief began to penetrate the numb shell of despair she had constructed around herself, another emotion rose with it, a fury so intense it made her hands shake. Lord Edmund approached her slowly, attempting to take her hand, but Isabel recoiled from his touch as though it burned. She stood from her cot, drawing herself to her full height despite her weakened state, and looked at him with eyes that held no forgiveness. She spoke then, her voice low and shaking with controlled rage. She told him what the past weeks had been like, the terror, the degradation, the knowledge that she would die for a crime she had not committed. She described the nights spent unable to breathe for panic, the moment when the judge had pronounced her death sentence, whilst the man she had foolishly loved had stood as witness to her condemnation. She asked him how he could have believed her capable of such evil. Lord Edmund bore her words like physical blows, making no attempt to defend himself. He acknowledged his failure with stark honesty. He admitted that he had allowed his grief over Lady Sienna's condition and his own wounded pride to cloud his judgment. He confessed that he had been too quick to accept the evidence presented. He had failed her, and he would carry that failure as a burden for the remainder of his days. But even as he spoke these words of contrition, Isabel found no comfort in them. The damage had been done. Trust had been shattered beyond repair. She informed him with cold finality that she desired nothing from him save her immediate removal from this place and his permanent absence from her life thereafter. Lord Edmund had arranged for a carriage to convey her back to Wimpole Street and for a physician to attend her there. He had also arranged for a substantial sum to be placed at her disposal, compensation for the suffering his failure had caused. In the days that followed, Mrs. Weatherby moved about the house with a humbled quietude, her usual sharp pronouncements replaced by a shame that kept her from meeting her niece's eyes. The horror of what had nearly transpired had broken her pride in a way poverty never could. As Isabel left Newgate Prison, emerging into morning sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the dimness of her cell, she felt no triumph in her vindication. She felt only exhaustion, anger, and a profound sense of loss, not for Lord Edmund himself, for that affection had been burned away in the fires of betrayal, but for the innocent hope she had once possessed. That hope had died during those weeks of imprisonment as surely as if she had mounted the scaffold. The antidote to arsenic poisoning, when such remedy exists, depends upon early intervention and the particular compound involved. Lord Edmund, driven by desperation and guilt, had spared no expense in consulting with every physician in London who might possess relevant knowledge. It was an elderly Scottish doctor, Dr. Malcolm Henriksen, recently arrived from Edinburgh, where he had been conducting research into toxic substances, who had finally offered a glimmer of hope. Dr. Henriksen had been summoned to the O'Brien residence in Grosvenor Square within hours of Lady Constance's confession. The Irish lady had been in critical state, her beautiful features gaunt and waxen, her body racked with convulsions. The Earl, her father, had been keeping vigil at her bedside with hollow-eyed desperation of a parent watching his child slip away. The treatment was highly experimental and perilous. Dr. Henriksen had warned the Earl frankly that the purging compounds were volatile, and the attempt to save Lady Sienna was as likely to kill her as the poison itself. It was simply the only chance she had. The effects initially appeared to worsen Lady Sienna's condition before any improvement could be observed. The compounds administered had caused violent purging that left her even weaker. Dr. Henriksen and his assistants had maintained constant attendance, monitoring every symptom, adjusting treatments in response to the patient's reactions. Lord Edmund, too, had been a frequent presence in the sick room, though his role had shifted from devoted suitor to something more complicated, a man driven by guilt and responsibility rather than romantic feeling. The chamber itself had become a place of vigil and penance, heavy with the sweet, medicinal scent of the tonics that lined the beside table, mingling with the sharper odor of illness. Lady Sienna's breathing came harsh and labored, each inhalation a struggle that Lord Edmund found himself counting, measuring, willing to continue. He watched the Irish beauty who had once danced with such vivacity, now reduced to fragile stillness against white linens, her auburn hair dark with perspiration, her emerald eyes closed more often than open. The contrast between her former vitality and this profound vulnerability struck him with physical force. It was during these long hours at Lady Sienna's bedside that Lord Edmund had been forced to examine the nature of his attachment to the Irish beauty. He had pursued her with such intensity, had been so quickly and thoroughly captivated by her vivacity and charm. Yet now, watching her suffer, feeling the weight of responsibility for having failed to protect her from Lady Constance's machinations, he recognized that his feelings had been more infatuation than love. He had been dazzled by her novelty, attracted by her beauty and spirits, but he had never truly known her as a person. More troublingly, as he sat in that sick room, his mind kept returning to Isabel St. Fair. He could not escape the memory of her face in that prison cell, the gauntness of her features, the barely controlled fury in her expression. He had done that to her. The guilt gnawed at him with teeth sharper than any romantic disappointment. After 10 days of intensive treatment, Lady Sienna had finally turned the corner toward recovery. The convulsions had ceased, her color had begun to improve, and she had regained enough strength to take nourishment and to speak in whispers. Dr. Henriksen had expressed cautious optimism that she would survive, though he warned that full recovery would require months of careful convalescence. As Lady Sienna's condition stabilized and she regained sufficient clarity of mind to understand what had transpired, Lord Edmund had felt obligated to inform her of the full circumstances surrounding her poisoning. He had told her, with careful gentleness, about Lady Constance's obsession and her elaborate scheme. He had explained how Isabel St. Fair had been falsely accused and had come within hours of execution before the truth had been revealed. Lady Sienna's reaction had been one of horror and profound sympathy. Despite her own suffering, her immediate concern had been for Miss St. Fair and the injustice she had endured. The Irish lady possessed a generous heart uncomplicated by the calculating nature that so often characterized members of the ton. It was during one of these conversations that Lady Sienna had asked Lord Edmund a question that cut to the heart of matters he had been avoiding confronting directly. She had inquired, with straightforwardness natural to her character, whether he truly wished to marry her, or whether his continued attendance stemmed primarily from guilt and obligation. Lord Edmund had been silent for a long moment. Lady Sienna, reading his hesitation accurately, had smiled with sad understanding. She had confessed, with equal honesty, that whilst she had been flattered by his attentions and had believed herself developing genuine affection for him, the ordeal of her poisoning had provided unwelcome clarity. She had recognized that their attachment had been based more on mutual attraction and the pressures of the marriage mart than on any deep knowledge of each other's characters. More significantly, Lady Sienna had observed during her convalescence that the physician attending her, Dr. Henriksen, had shown her a kindness and genuine care that went beyond professional duty. The Scottish doctor was her own age, possessed of strong features and an intensity of purpose that she found compelling. During her worst moments, it had been his voice providing encouragement, his steady presence offering comfort. A connection had formed between patient and physician that suggested possibilities neither had anticipated. Lord Edmund, rather than feeling wounded by this revelation, had experienced primarily relief. Lady Sienna's honesty freed him from obligations he had recognized as increasingly burdensome. They had agreed with mutual respect and surprising affection for two people dissolving a courtship that they would not suit. The Earl, Lady Sienna's father, had been surprisingly understanding when informed of this development. He had recognized that his daughter's attachment to her physician was genuine. This resolution left Lord Edmund free, but without clear direction. He had been released from one obligation only to be confronted more forcefully with another, the debt he owed to Isabel St. Fair. Yet how could he possibly make amends when the lady refused all contact with him? The answer was that he could not restore what had been lost. Trust, once shattered so completely, could not be simply glued back together. But perhaps, if he devoted himself to the task with patience and genuine humility, he might build something new, something different and possibly stronger for having been tested and refined by suffering. Lord Edmund set himself to a campaign of quiet, persistent action. He would prove through deeds rather than words that he had learned from his failures. Act 6. The Campaign of Redemption. The restoration of Isabel St. Fair's reputation required more than legal vindication. The Tun possessed an unforgiving memory, quick to condemn, slow to exonerate, and always ready to maintain a residue of suspicion even in the face of proven innocence. What was required was systematic public action that would make the cost of doubting her exoneration too high for society to bear. Lord Edmund's first action was to ensure that Lady Constance Hartley's trial received maximum public attention. The widow's prosecution was conducted with all the formality and publicity that befitted a crime involving members of the aristocracy. Lord Edmund provided testimony with such authority and detail that no doubt could remain about the widow's guilt or Miss St. Fair's complete innocence. He made certain that every newspaper in London carried full accounts, emphasizing repeatedly that an innocent woman had been wrongly accused. Lady Constance was convicted and sentenced to transportation to New South Wales for 14 years, a sentence that would remove her permanently from English society. The severity of her punishment helped to emphasize, by contrast, the grave injustice that had nearly been perpetrated against Isabel. Simultaneously, Lord Edmund launched a quieter but equally important campaign to restore Isabel's social standing. He began by calling upon Lady Victoria Montrose and requesting her assistance in championing Miss St. Fair's cause among the highest circles of the Tun. The Dowager Countess, who had developed particular interest in the case and respect for Isabel's dignified bearing, agreed with enthusiasm. Lady Victoria began by hosting an intimate gathering at her residence, inviting a carefully selected group of influential ladies, including two patronesses of Almack's. During this gathering, Lady Victoria spoke at length about Isabel's character, her grace under unbearable pressure, and the injustice she had suffered. The Dowager made it clear that anyone who continued to cast aspersions on Miss St. Fair's reputation would be considered to have insulted Lady Victoria herself. Lord Edmund supported these efforts through his own actions, though he was careful never to approach Isabel directly. He made substantial anonymous donations to prison reform societies, specifically earmarking funds for improving conditions for female prisoners and ensuring better legal representation for those accused of crimes. Whilst officially anonymous, he ensured through strategic leaks that word spread regarding their source and motivation. He also arranged for Mrs. Dilworth's circumstances to be investigated, discovering that the woman had been driven to participate in Lady Constance's scheme by desperate poverty. Rather than seeing her prosecuted, Lord Edmund arranged for charges to be quietly dropped in exchange for her truthful testimony and provided funds for her to relocate to Yorkshire, where distant family could support her establishment in honest employment. 6 months after Isabel's release from Newgate, Lord Edmund took a more direct action that he knew risked her displeasure. He published a letter in the Times, addressed generally to London society, but clearly intended for one particular reader. In this letter, he publicly acknowledged his failure to believe in Miss St. Fair's innocence when the evidence of her character should have outweighed circumstantial proof of guilt. He admitted that he had allowed grief and wounded pride to cloud his judgment. He stated clearly that Miss St. Fair was a lady of impeccable character who had been grievously wronged. The letter was widely read and discussed throughout London. The effect was precisely what he had intended. It became impossible for anyone in society to continue questioning Isabel's innocence without implicitly accusing a viscount of either lying or being a fool. Yet despite all these efforts, despite the restoration of her reputation and improvement of her material circumstances, Isabel remained isolated and withdrawn. Reports Lord Edmund received suggested that she moved through her days with mechanical efficiency, but without joy, as though something essential in her spirit had been damaged beyond repair. It was Lady Victoria Montrose who finally intervened directly. The Dowager Countess called upon Isabel at Wimpole Street and requested a private audience. When the two ladies were alone, Lady Victoria spoke with characteristic directness about Lord Edmund's efforts on Isabel's behalf and his scrupulous respect for her desire to avoid his company. The Dowager suggested, with gentle but firm wisdom, that whilst Isabel's anger was entirely justified, there might come a point when refusal to forgive became more burdensome than the original injury. Isabel listened with courtesy and genuine gratitude for the woman's intervention in uncovering the truth. But when she responded, her voice carried an edge of pain that made clear the depth of damage that had been done. She explained that it was not a simple matter of withholding forgiveness out of spite. The issue was one of trust destroyed so completely that she could no longer imagine rebuilding it. Lord Edmund had believed her capable of murder based on circumstantial evidence. How could she ever trust his regard again? Isabel asked with quiet intensity, when she now knew how fragile that regard had been. How could she believe in his professed contrition when she had once believed in his professed interest, and that belief had proven so painfully mistaken? Lady Victoria had not argued against these points, recognizing their validity. Instead, she had suggested that Isabel might benefit from a period away from London, somewhere she could begin to heal without constant reminders of her ordeal. The Dowager mentioned that she maintained a residence in Bath that stood empty most of the year. Would Miss St. Fair consider accepting the use of this house for a season or two? Isabel had been initially reluctant to accept what seemed like charity, but Lady Victoria had presented it as a favor. The house needed occupation to prevent deterioration. With some persuasion, and with Mrs. Weatherby's encouragement, Isabel had finally agreed. When Lord Edmund learned of Isabel's planned removal to Bath, he had experienced conflicting emotions. Relief that she would be away from the scene of her suffering, but also profound disappointment that physical distance would make any possibility of reconciliation even more remote. What Lord Edmund did not know was that Isabel's withdrawal from London was motivated by more than simply a desire to escape painful memories. She was fleeing from feelings that terrified her, the recognition that despite everything, despite the betrayal and the suffering, some part of her heart remained stubbornly, foolishly attached to the man who had condemned her. She hated herself for this weakness. Distance, she hoped desperately, would finally allow her to excise this unwanted affection. The city of Bath in autumn possessed a gentler beauty than London's harsh grandeur. The honey-colored stone of its Georgian architecture glowed warmly in slanting light, and the surrounding hills were painted with russet and gold of turning leaves. Isabel found in it a measure of peace she had not known in months. Lady Victoria's residence proved to be a charming townhouse on Queen Square, furnished with taste, but not ostentation. Mrs. Weatherby had accompanied her niece to Bath, and the elderly woman seemed to relax in the calmer atmosphere, the worst of the tension between them gradually easing. Isabel had begun to venture out more frequently, attending concerts at the assembly rooms, taking the waters at the pump room, walking in the Sydney Gardens. She was slowly, painfully rebuilding some capacity for ordinary life, though she recognized that a fundamental innocence had been lost. It was several weeks into her residence in Bath that Isabel received an unexpected letter. It had been delivered through Lady Victoria, and the Dowager had presented it with the observation that Miss St. Fair was under no obligation to read it if she preferred not to. The letter was from Lord Edmund Carrington. Isabel had held that sealed letter for 2 days before finding the courage to break the wax. When she finally did, she found not the pleading protestations of affection she had half expected, nor elaborate justifications for his conduct. Instead, Lord Edmund had written with stark honesty about his recognition of her right to refuse all contact with him, but his hope that she might allow him to explain certain matters that affected her material security. He had discovered, through his investigation of Lady Constance's affairs, that the widow had been in possession of documents belonging to Isabel's late father. These documents indicated that Sir Matthew Saintfair had been owed substantial sums by various gentlemen for debts of honor they had never paid, debts that, if collected, would restore Isabel to comfortable independence. Lord Edmund had taken it upon himself to pursue these debts, using his own influence and resources to encourage payment. The letter explained that these collected funds had been placed in trust for Miss Saintfair's benefit, managed by reputable solicitors whose names and direction were provided. The sum was sufficient to provide her with an independent income that would allow her to maintain her own establishment without dependence on anyone. Lord Edmund made clear that this money was rightfully hers, that he had merely facilitated its recovery. The letter concluded with a request that she might, if she found it possible, allow him a single meeting. Not for the purpose of pleading his own cause or seeking her forgiveness, but because there were things he needed to say to her that could not be adequately conveyed through written correspondence. If she declined, he would respect her decision absolutely. Isabel had read and reread this letter. The recovery of her father's debts meant she would no longer be dependent on anyone. It was a freedom she had never imagined possessing. But the question was whether she could bear to face Lord Edmund again. After a week of agonizing deliberation, Isabel wrote a brief response. She agreed to meet with Lord Edmund Carrington, but only under specific conditions. The meeting would take place at Lady Victoria's residence, with the Dowager present. It would be of limited duration, no more than 1 hour, and it would represent their final interaction. Lord Edmund's reply had come swiftly. He agreed to all her conditions without hesitation and proposed a date 2 weeks hence. Those 2 weeks passed with excruciating slowness. Isabel found herself unable to settle to any activity, her mind constantly rehearsing what she might say. The day of the meeting arrived with gray December skies that matched Isabel's turbulent emotions. She dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of deep blue wool that conveyed dignity and composure. She noted with satisfaction that the shadows beneath her eyes had faded and her features had regained some of their former fullness. She would face Lord Edmund not as the broken woman he had last seen in Newgate, but as someone who had survived. When Lord Edmund Carrington was announced, Isabel felt her breath catch. He entered the room and stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes finding hers immediately. The months since she had last seen him had marked him visibly. He appeared thinner, the aristocratic planes of his face more pronounced, and there were lines of care around his eyes that had not been present before. But it was the expression in those dark eyes that arrested her, an intensity of feeling barely restrained, a vulnerability she had never before witnessed in him. He bowed with perfect correctness, his voice carefully controlled but rough with emotion. He thanked Miss Saintfair for agreeing to see him, acknowledging that she granted him more grace than he deserved. He greeted Lady Victoria with genuine warmth. The three of them settled into their arranged seats, and for a moment, silence hung in the room. Then Lord Edmund began to speak, and once started, the words flowed from him with the force of long suppression finally released. He told Isabel that he had spent every day since her imprisonment, examining his failure, trying to understand how he could have been so blind. He acknowledged that there was no adequate excuse for his conduct. Grief over Lady Sienna and anger at being deceived might explain, but could not justify his willingness to believe the worst of Isabel without truly investigating. He confessed that his wounded pride had clouded his judgment. Lord Edmund spoke of what he had learned through his work on prison reform and wrongful convictions. He had met dozens of people who had been falsely accused, had heard their stories, had recognized in their experiences echoes of what Isabel had endured. The work had become not merely an act of penance, but a genuine calling. But beyond these public efforts, Lord Edmund continued. He needed Isabel to understand something more personal. During the months of his courtship of her in the spring, he had felt something he had never before experienced, a sense of genuine connection that went beyond surface attraction. Their conversations had engaged his mind and touched something deeper in his spirit. When he had looked at her, he had begun to imagine a future that excited rather than merely satisfied him. He had been falling in love with her, though he had not possessed the wisdom to name that feeling or the courage to act upon it with decisiveness. Then Lady Sienna had appeared, and Lord Edmund admitted with painful honesty that he had been dazzled by her novelty. He had transferred his attentions to the Irish lady not because his feelings for Isabel had been false, but because he had been a fool who did not recognize the value of what he was abandoning until too late. His pursuit of Lady Sienna had been shallow, where his growing attachment to Isabel had possessed depth, but he had been too immature to recognize the difference. When Lady Sienna had been poisoned and evidence had pointed to Isabel, Lord Edmund confessed that he had wanted desperately not to believe it. But the evidence had seemed overwhelming, and he had allowed himself to be convinced because some dark part of him had felt he deserved such betrayal. He had testified, as he had not out of certainty of her guilt, but out of complex mixture of grief, confusion, and paralyzing recognition, that he bore responsibility. Lord Edmund's voice had grown hoarse as he spoke of his horror upon discovering the truth. The knowledge that he had condemned an innocent woman, that he had contributed to her conviction and near execution, had devastated him. The image of her face in that prison cell would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Not because he sought to wallow in guilt, but because he never wanted to forget the cost of his failure. He loved her, Lord Edmund stated with quiet intensity. He loved her with a depth and certainty that his earlier shallow attachments had never approached. He loved her character, her dignity in the face of unbearable injustice, her strength. He loved her mind, her compassion, the person he had been privileged to glimpse. But Lord Edmund made clear that he offered this declaration not as a plea for reciprocation, but simply as truth she deserved to know. He recognized that his failure had destroyed any possibility of trust between them. He understood that love could not exist without trust, and trust once shattered so completely could not be simply wished back into existence. He did not expect her to forgive him. He wanted only for her to know that she had been loved, and that she deserved to be loved far better than he had proven capable. When Lord Edmund finished speaking, silence filled the room. Lady Victoria sat quietly, her elderly eyes bright with unshed tears. Isabel remained motionless, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale but composed. Then it was Isabel's turn to speak, and when she did, her voice was steady despite the emotions churning within her. She acknowledged that she believed Lord Edmund's remorse was genuine, that his efforts at reform demonstrated real commitment to change. She recognized that he had been manipulated and that he had acted from misguided conviction rather than malice. But belief in his sincerity and recognition of mitigating circumstances did not erase the fundamental truth of what had occurred. Isabel described what those weeks in Newgate had been like. The terror, the degradation, the nights when she had been unable to breathe for panic. She spoke of standing in court and seeing him testify, watching the man she had loved confirm society's worst judgment of her character. She explained how that betrayal had cut deeper than the wrongful accusation itself, how it had taught her that she could not trust her own judgment about people or about love. She told him that she had tried to hate him during those dark weeks, had wanted to hate him because hatred was simpler than the complicated tangle of love and betrayal and hurt that actually consumed her. But she had discovered that she could not manage genuine hatred, only a profound disappointment that was somehow worse. Yet as Isabel spoke, as she watched Lord Edmund bear her words without flinching or attempting to defend himself, as she saw the genuine anguish in his expression, something within her began to shift. She recognized that he was not the same man who had testified against her. Suffering had refined him, forced him to examine himself with brutal honesty, transformed him into someone capable of genuine humility. And she recognized, with reluctant honesty of her own, that she was not the same woman who had been arrested those months ago. She had been tested in ways that had stripped away illusions, but had also revealed reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. Trust, once destroyed, could not be simply restored. But perhaps, Isabel heard herself saying with wonder at her own words, perhaps trust could be rebuilt slowly, carefully, through sustained demonstration rather than mere declaration. Perhaps the very fact that they had both been so thoroughly broken meant they understood the preciousness of what they might attempt to create together, something tempered by suffering and therefore stronger for having survived the fire. She was not promising anything, Isabel made clear. She was not forgiving him, not accepting his declaration of love, not agreeing to courtship. But perhaps, and she spoke this word with careful deliberation, perhaps she was willing to allow the possibility of discovering whether redemption was possible, whether they might build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Lord Edmund had looked at her with expression of such hope and gratitude that Isabel felt her breath catch. He had agreed immediately to whatever terms she set, whatever pace she required. He would prove himself through action rather than words, would demonstrate through sustained behavior that he was worthy of the second chance she was tentatively considering. Lady Victoria, who had remained silent throughout these exchanges, had smiled with satisfaction. The Dowager suggested that perhaps Lord Edmund might extend his stay in Bath, that he might call upon Miss St. Fair under proper circumstances, that they might begin the slow process of rebuilding acquaintance with no expectations beyond discovering whether friendship, and perhaps eventually something more, might be possible. The seasons turned with their customary rhythm, but the passage of time meant something different now for Isabel St. Fair and Edmund Carrington. Winter yielded to spring, spring to summer, and with each turning of the calendar, trust was rebuilt in small increments. A morning walk taken together through Sydney Gardens, a conversation that revealed vulnerability on both sides, a moment when Isabel reached for Edmund's hand and found comfort rather than fear in the contact. Edmund did not rush. He understood that trust destroyed so completely required patient reconstruction. He called upon Isabel with scrupulous propriety, always with proper chaperonage, always mindful of her comfort and wishes. He shared with her the progress of his work on prison reform, the letters he wrote to Parliament, the families he had helped through his advocacy. He demonstrated through consistent action that his commitment to justice was not merely performance designed to win her regard, but genuine transformation of character. Isabel, for her part, found herself slowly opening to the possibility she had thought forever closed to her. She observed Edmund's behavior with the careful attention of one who had learned too well the cost of misjudgment, and what she saw convinced her gradually that the change in him was authentic. He had been tested by failure and had emerged from that test as a better man, more thoughtful, more humble, more capable of genuine love than the aristocrat who had courted her so carelessly in the previous spring. It was nearly a year after that first meeting in Bath when Edmund asked Isabel to walk with him in the gardens one autumn morning. The leaves were turning again, painting the landscape with the same russet and gold that had greeted her arrival in Bath. They walked in comfortable silence until Edmund stopped beside a bench overlooking the river, and there, with voice shaking with emotion, he asked if she might consider becoming his wife. He did not offer flowery declarations or elaborate promises. He simply told her that he loved her, that he had learned from his failures, and that he wished to spend the remainder of his life proving himself worthy of her trust. He acknowledged that she had every right to refuse, that he would respect her decision whatever it might be, but that he hoped, with all his heart he hoped, that she might believe in the possibility of their future together. Isabel had looked at him for a long moment, this man who had once broken her heart so completely, who had condemned her to death, and who had then spent months demonstrating through action his commitment to becoming someone deserving of her love. She thought of the terror she had experienced in Newgate, the betrayal she had felt in that courtroom, but she thought also of the woman she had become. The fires of Newgate had forged a strength in her that could not be broken. She realized then that true forgiveness was not a gift she was giving him, but rather a power she was claiming for herself, the power to refuse to let bitterness write the final chapter of her story. She was choosing to build a future not in spite of her scars, but because of the wisdom they had granted her. She said yes. Their wedding took place quietly in the spring of 1816, not in London where too many painful memories lingered, but at Edmund's estate in Derbyshire. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by family and close friends, including Lady Victoria Montrose, whose intervention had saved Isabel's life and whose wisdom had helped guide them toward reconciliation. Lady Sienna O'Brien, now Dr. Henrikson's wife and happily settled in Ireland, had sent warm congratulations along with regrets that her health did not permit travel. But the marriage itself was only the beginning of what they built together. Edmund and Isabel, united by shared understanding of how fragile justice could be and how easily innocent lives could be destroyed, dedicated themselves to reform. They established a fund to provide legal representation for those accused of crimes who could not afford adequate defense. They worked with parliamentary committees investigating wrongful convictions. They visited prisons and advocated for improved conditions. Their work was not merely charitable gesture or social performance. It was the transformation of their personal tragedy into purposeful action that might spare others similar suffering. They had been broken and then remade, and in that remaking had discovered not only their love for each other, but their shared calling to ensure that the failure which had nearly destroyed them might become the foundation for preventing similar failures in future. Years later, when they sat together in the library of Carrington Hall, watching their children play in the gardens beyond, Isabel would sometimes reflect on the journey that had brought them to this place. She had been wrongly accused, condemned to die, saved at the last moment, and had somehow found the courage to forgive and to love the man whose failure had nearly cost her everything. It should have been impossible, and yet here they were, happy in a way that shallow romance never could have achieved, their bond forged in suffering and tempered by the hard work of rebuilding trust. Edmund would catch her in these moments of reflection, and he would reach for her hand, and they would sit in comfortable silence that spoke of understanding too deep for words. He had learned that love was not simply passion or attraction, but commitment demonstrated through sustained action. She had learned that forgiveness was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Together, they had transformed injustice into justice, betrayal into redemption, and despair into hope. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even through the shadow of the gallows, even through betrayal and wrongful condemnation. True love, the kind that survives the severest tests and emerges stronger for having been tried, proves itself not in the ease of courtship, but in the courage of redemption. The Viscount and Viscountess Carrington had discovered this truth through suffering that might have destroyed lesser bonds, and in that discovery had found a happiness more profound than any they might have known had their path been simpler. Their story became whispered legend among the ton, a reminder that justice could fail, but love might still triumph, that trust destroyed could be painstakingly rebuilt, and that the deepest connections were those that survived being shattered and were carefully pieced back together with patience, humility, and unwavering commitment. It was a tale that spoke to the best possibilities of the human heart and to the transformative power of love that refuses to accept defeat even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.